Dave Chappelle didn't wake up one day planning to become the biggest lightning rod in modern comedy. He didn't campaign to lead a culture war, and he never claimed to be the spokesman for free speech. But somehow, every time another controversy erupted, every time another joke sparked outrage, and every time critics declared his career was finally over, Dave did the exact opposite of what everyone expected. He walked back on stage, grabbed the microphone, and turned the backlash itself into the next punchline. For years, people have argued that certain topics should simply be off-limits. They believed some jokes crossed lines that should never be touched. But Dave Chappelle kept asking one uncomfortable question. If comedians can't joke about difficult subjects, what happens to comedy itself? That question transformed him from one of the world's funniest entertainers into one of the most talked-about figures in entertainment. What makes Dave's story so fascinating isn't that everyone agrees with him. Far from it. It's that every attempt to silence him seemed to make his audience even larger. Critics wrote articles. Social media exploded with outrage. Petitions circulated. Yet his comedy specials continued breaking records, his shows continued selling out, and the conversations surrounding his work only grew louder. Some people called his jokes fearless. Others called them offensive. Some believed he was defending artistic freedom, while others believed he had gone too far. But no matter which side people stood on, one thing became impossible to deny. When Dave Chappelle stepped onto a stage, the entire entertainment world paid attention. And that's exactly what we're exploring today. From unforgettable stand-up moments to headline-making controversies, from brutally honest observations to razor-sharp comebacks, we'll break down the times Dave Chappelle answered criticism with savage humor instead of surrender. Along the way, you'll see why his biggest critics often became the setup for his strongest material, and why one particular controversy would ignite a debate that continues to this day. If there's one thing Dave Chappelle has proven throughout his career, it's that he's never been interested in playing it safe. From the moment he burst onto the comedy scene, his reputation wasn't built on telling comfortable jokes or chasing universal approval. Instead, he built it by tackling controversial topics head-on, finding humor in places most comedians wouldn't dare explore. Whether people laughed, gasped, or argued about his material afterward, Dave always seemed to believe that starting an honest conversation was more valuable than avoiding one altogether. As the entertainment industry evolved and public conversations around comedy became more heated, the pressure on performers changed dramatically. More than ever, comedians found themselves under intense scrutiny, with every joke dissected, debated, and sometimes condemned within minutes. For many, that meant becoming more cautious with their material. But Dave Chappelle chose a completely different path. Rather than stepping away from difficult subjects, he leaned into them, arguing that comedy loses its purpose the moment fear begins deciding what's allowed to be funny. That approach quickly made him one of the most polarizing figures in modern entertainment. Every new special sparked headlines. Every interview generated debate. Social media erupted with arguments from supporters and critics alike. Some praised him as a fearless defender of artistic freedom, while others believed his jokes crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. Regardless of which side people took, almost everyone agreed on one thing. When Dave Chappelle released new material, the entire entertainment world stopped to pay attention. What separated Dave from many of his peers wasn't simply his willingness to court controversy. It was the way he responded once the criticism arrived. Instead of issuing carefully crafted statements or backing away from his material, he often addressed the backlash directly in his next performance, transforming public outrage into fresh comedy. For Dave, the criticism itself became part of the act, creating a cycle where each new controversy fueled another conversation, and another sold-out show. Over the years, that philosophy would put him at the center of some of comedy's biggest cultural debates. From political correctness and cancel culture to artistic freedom and the limits of satire, Dave repeatedly challenged audiences to think beyond the immediate reaction to a joke. Whether viewers agreed with his perspective or strongly disagreed, he consistently argued that context, intent, and open discussion matter just as much as the punchline itself. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the moments that defined that reputation. We'll explore the performances, interviews, and public debates that turned Dave Chappelle into one of the most talked-about comedians of his generation, examining how he answered criticism with sharp wit, unwavering confidence, and a commitment to defending his approach to comedy. By the end, you'll understand why his name continues to dominate conversations about humor, free expression, and the evolving relationship between comedians and their audiences. It didn't take long for Dave Chappelle to realize that in modern comedy, the joke is often only the beginning of the story. Sometimes the biggest controversy isn't what gets said on stage, it's what people remember after they've left the room. And one of the earliest moments that hinted at the battles ahead started with what should have been nothing more than a casual interaction with an audience member. During one performance, Dave noticed a couple sitting near the front of the crowd. Like many comedians do, he began chatting with them, trying to loosen up the room with spontaneous conversation. The exchange seemed harmless enough at first, but as the conversation continued, he sensed that one member of the couple wasn't enjoying the attention nearly as much as everyone else. Rather than ignore the awkwardness, Dave did what he's built an entire career doing. He leaned into it. He responded with quick observations and playful humor, trying to ease the tension instead of letting it derail the performance. Most of the audience laughed, the conversation moved on, and for everyone inside the venue, it seemed like just another unscripted moment that happens during live comedy. But in today's world, a joke rarely stays inside the theater. Not long after the show, criticism began appearing, with some people arguing that the exchange had crossed a line. What had been received as improvisational comedy by many audience members was interpreted very differently by others. Suddenly, a routine crowd interaction had become part of a much larger debate about race, identity, and what comedians should, or shouldn't, say on stage. For many performers, that kind of backlash might have been enough to encourage a more cautious approach going forward. After all, every headline brings new scrutiny, and every controversy carries the risk of damaging a reputation. But Dave Chappelle has never built his career around avoiding uncomfortable conversations. Instead of treating the criticism as something to hide from, he addressed it in the same place where it all began, on stage. He spoke about how easily jokes can be separated from their original context, arguing that comedy often loses its meaning when a single line is pulled away from the full performance. To him, a stand-up set isn't a collection of isolated quotes. It's a conversation with an audience where timing, tone, and context shape how every joke lands. That response became one of the earliest signs of a pattern that would define the next chapter of his career. Every time controversy followed him, Dave didn't retreat. He returned with another performance, another perspective, and another opportunity to challenge the criticism through comedy itself. Looking back, this wasn't simply an argument over one joke or one audience interaction. It marked the beginning of a much bigger cultural clash. As public debates over comedy continued to intensify, Dave Chappelle increasingly found himself at the center of them. Not because he claimed to have all the answers, but because he refused to stop asking uncomfortable questions. And that was only the beginning. Before long, he would move beyond individual audience moments and begin taking aim at something much bigger: the growing pressure to sanitize comedy in the name of political correctness. For Dave Chappelle, the biggest threat to comedy was never a bad review or a silent audience. It was the growing belief that comedians should constantly calculate every possible reaction before telling a joke. As public conversations became increasingly polarized, he watched more performers begin avoiding entire subjects. Not because they weren't funny, but because the potential backlash simply wasn't worth the risk. Dave saw that change as a turning point. Throughout his stand-up career, he has argued that comedy isn't supposed to make everyone comfortable. In his view, the best jokes often force people to confront ideas they'd rather avoid, shining a light on contradictions, hypocrisy, and uncomfortable truths through laughter. If every joke had to pass a test of universal approval, he believed comedy would lose the very quality that makes it meaningful. That philosophy became increasingly clear in his performances. Rather than steering away from controversial issues, Dave often walked directly toward them, fully aware that some audience members would laugh while others might strongly disagree. To him, that tension wasn't a flaw in comedy, it was part of its purpose. As criticism grew louder, so did his response. Instead of apologizing every time a joke sparked debate, Dave challenged the idea that offense alone should determine whether a joke deserves to exist. He repeatedly suggested that disagreement is inevitable in a society filled with different perspectives and experiences. Trying to eliminate every possibility of offense, he argued, would leave comedians constantly second-guessing themselves instead of creating honest, original work. That message resonated with many fans who felt that comedy had become increasingly cautious. They saw Dave as someone willing to defend the idea that audiences don't have to agree with every joke to appreciate the craft behind it. Others, however, believed that certain topics require greater sensitivity and that comedians also bear responsibility for the impact of their words. Those opposing views turned nearly every new Chappelle special into a national conversation. Reviews, opinion pieces, television debates, and endless social media discussions often followed his performances. While critics focused on specific jokes they considered offensive, supporters frequently pointed to the larger themes Dave was trying to explore, arguing that his routines were meant to provoke thought rather than simply shock audiences. Dave himself often emphasized that context matters. A stand-up routine, he suggested, isn't a list of disconnected one-liners. It's a carefully structured performance where individual jokes build toward broader observations about society, human behavior, and the contradictions people live with every day. Removing one line from that larger framework, he argued, can dramatically change how the material is interpreted. Ironically, the louder the criticism became, the more attention his comedy received. People who had never watched an entire special often became curious enough to see what the debate was about. Supporters praised his willingness to continue performing without dramatically changing his style, while critics continued questioning whether some jokes went too far. Either way, one thing became impossible to ignore. Dave Chappelle had become one of the central figures in the broader debate over artistic freedom, political correctness, and the role of comedy in modern culture. And before long, he would take that debate even further, not by avoiding the growing conversation around cancel culture, but by turning the entire idea into one of his sharpest comedic targets. By the time cancel culture had become one of the most debated topics in entertainment, many celebrities were walking on eggshells. A single interview, an old social media post, or even a joke taken out of context could dominate headlines overnight. Public apologies became increasingly common, and many performers chose to avoid controversial subjects altogether. But Dave Chappelle took a completely different approach. Instead of treating cancel culture as something to fear, he treated it as comedy material. While others worried about saying the wrong thing, Dave began openly discussing the growing culture of public outrage during his performances. Rather than pretending the criticism didn't exist, he brought it directly into his routines, inviting audiences to laugh at the very phenomenon dominating the news cycle. It was an unusual strategy. Instead of running away from controversy, he turned it into part of the show. His point wasn't simply that criticism is unfair. Dave often suggested that disagreement has always existed in comedy. Throughout history, comedians have challenged audiences, pushed boundaries, and tested social norms. What had changed, in his view, wasn't comedy itself, but the speed and intensity with which public outrage could spread online. He also questioned the idea that online backlash always reflects public opinion as a whole. A topic might dominate social media for days, creating the impression that everyone had reached the same conclusion. Yet when Dave stepped onto a stage, he often found theaters filled with people eager to hear exactly the kind of material that critics claimed should no longer exist. That contrast became one of the most talked about aspects of his career. While headlines focused on controversy, his live performances continued drawing enthusiastic audiences. His comedy specials generated widespread discussion, and his influence within stand-up remained undeniable. Whether people loved his approach or strongly disagreed with it, they continued paying attention whenever he released new material. Dave frequently used humor to highlight what he saw as the contradictions of modern outrage. He pointed out how quickly public attention could move from one controversy to the next, with each new headline replacing the last before deeper conversations had a chance to happen. In his view, the cycle often rewarded emotional reactions more than thoughtful discussion. Supporters saw this as one of Dave's greatest strengths. They believed he wasn't simply making jokes about controversial topics. He was using comedy to examine the culture surrounding those controversies. Critics, on the other hand, argued that some subjects deserved more sensitivity and that comedians should consider the broader impact of their words. The disagreement itself became part of the larger conversation surrounding his work. But if there was one lesson Dave seemed determined to demonstrate, it was this: being criticized didn't automatically mean being silenced. For him, controversy wasn't the end of a performance. It was often the beginning of the next one. Every wave of backlash created another opportunity to respond through the medium he knew best: stand-up comedy. As the debates continued, something unexpected happened. Instead of shrinking his audience, the controversies often made more people curious about what he had actually said. Viewers who had only seen headlines started watching entire specials to judge for themselves, and the discussion around Dave's work grew even larger than before. That growing attention set the stage for one of the biggest moments of his career. His next major comedy special wouldn't just spark another argument. It would ignite an international debate about artistic freedom, comedy, and where the line between humor and offense should be drawn. The debate surrounding Dave Chappelle had been building for years, but nothing compared to what happened when one of his later stand-up specials became the center of a worldwide cultural conversation. Long before many people had even watched the full performance, headlines were already declaring it one of the most controversial comedy specials ever released. Supporters praised it as fearless, while critics argued that some of its jokes crossed important lines. Almost overnight, the special became far more than entertainment. It became a symbol in a much larger argument about the future of comedy. What made the situation so unusual was that people weren't just debating individual punchlines. They were debating the very purpose of stand-up itself. Should comedy be judged solely by the words being spoken, or should the audience also consider the context, the performer, and the broader message behind the routine? Dave believed those questions mattered just as much as the jokes themselves. As discussions intensified, social media filled with passionate opinions from every direction. Some viewers celebrated Dave for refusing to change his style, arguing that comedians should be free to explore uncomfortable subjects without fear of public pressure. Others believed that with such a large platform came greater responsibility, insisting that influential performers should think more carefully about the impact their material might have. The disagreement quickly spread beyond comedy fans. News outlets, television panels, podcast hosts, and entertainment commentators all weighed in, turning the special into one of the biggest stories in the industry. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, whether they had seen the entire performance or only read excerpts from it. Individual jokes were quoted, analyzed, criticized, and defended, often without the full context of the complete routine. Dave, however, continued returning to a point he had made throughout his career. Comedy is an art form, and like any art form, it depends on context. A stand-up special isn't simply a collection of isolated jokes. It's a carefully structured performance where stories, observations, and punchlines build on one another to create a larger message. Remove one moment from that structure, he argued, and you risk changing its meaning entirely. That perspective became one of the defining themes of the controversy. Supporters argued that critics were focusing too heavily on individual lines while overlooking the broader narrative Dave was trying to tell. They believed the performance invited audiences to wrestle with complicated ideas rather than offering simple answers. Critics, on the other hand, maintained that intent alone doesn't erase the potential impact of certain jokes, especially when they involve deeply personal or sensitive subjects. The result was a debate with no easy resolution. Yet amid all the criticism, one fact stood out. Public interest in Dave Chappelle's work didn't disappear, it intensified. The special attracted enormous attention, drawing viewers who wanted to see the performance for themselves rather than relying on secondhand reactions. Whether they ultimately agreed with Dave or not, millions decided to judge the material firsthand instead of accepting someone else's interpretation. For Dave, that may have been the most revealing outcome of all. The louder the controversy became, the more people engaged directly with his work. Instead of ending the conversation, the backlash expanded it, proving that attempts to limit discussion can sometimes generate even greater curiosity. But perhaps the most surprising part wasn't the controversy itself. It was what Dave chose to do next. Rather than stepping away from the debate or issuing carefully crafted statements, he addressed the criticism in the place where he has always felt most comfortable, standing under a spotlight with a microphone, turning the outrage into fresh material and reminding audiences that, in his view, comedy should always be allowed to challenge, provoke, and spark conversation. One of the biggest reasons Dave Chappelle remained at the center of the conversation wasn't just because of the jokes he told. It was because of the way he responded when the criticism arrived. In an era where public figures often released lengthy statements or carefully worded apologies after facing backlash, Dave chose a completely different strategy. He went back on stage. For him, the microphone was always the place where he could explain himself best. Instead of holding press conferences or engaging in endless debates online, Dave often addressed the controversy during his stand-up performances. He acknowledged that people were talking about him, but rather than sounding defensive, he used humor to examine the situation from his own perspective. The criticism itself became part of the routine, allowing him to respond in the same artistic medium that had sparked the debate in the first place. That approach surprised many people. Normally, public controversy follows a familiar pattern. A joke goes viral, headlines appear, social media reacts, and the celebrity issues a statement designed to calm the situation. Dave rarely followed that script. Rather than trying to end the conversation as quickly as possible, he often leaned into it, suggesting that disagreement is an unavoidable part of creating honest art. He repeatedly argued that if comedians begin shaping every joke around the possibility of public backlash, something essential is lost. In his view, comedy works because it explores uncomfortable ideas, exposes contradictions, and encourages audiences to think from unexpected angles. If every punchline had to satisfy every audience member, the creative process itself would become restricted. That message became especially clear whenever critics suggested he should simply stop discussing certain topics altogether. Dave pushed back against that idea, not by claiming everyone had to like his material, but by defending the broader principle that artists should have room to experiment, take risks, and sometimes fail without every controversial moment becoming a permanent label attached to their careers. He often emphasized that audiences are free to disagree, criticize, or even decide not to watch, but that artistic expression shouldn't be shaped solely by fear of negative reactions. Supporters viewed this as a defense of creative independence. They argued that Dave wasn't asking for immunity from criticism. Instead, they believed he was defending the right of comedians to tell difficult jokes while accepting that audiences would ultimately decide whether those jokes succeeded or failed. From that perspective, the answer to a joke someone dislikes isn't censorship. It's more conversation, more criticism, or simply choosing different entertainment. Critics, however, saw the issue differently. Many believed that influential comedians carry significant responsibility because their words reach millions of people. They argued that freedom of expression and accountability can exist side by side, and that criticism is also a form of free expression. To them, questioning a comedian's material wasn't an attack on comedy itself, but part of a broader public discussion about where humor intersects with real-world consequences. Dave never pretended those disagreements didn't exist. Instead, he often acknowledged that audiences would always interpret comedy differently depending on their own experiences, beliefs, and perspectives. Rather than trying to eliminate those differences, he seemed willing to let them become part of the conversation. Whether people left laughing, debating, or strongly disagreeing, he appeared to believe that provoking thought was one of comedy's most valuable functions. Ironically, every new wave of criticism seemed to strengthen the very reputation his critics hoped would fade. His performances continued attracting packed audiences, his specials remained among the most discussed in entertainment, and each controversy fueled renewed interest in what he might say next. Instead of retreating from the spotlight, Dave consistently demonstrated that his response to criticism would not come through carefully crafted headlines. It would come through another performance. But while defending his own comedy was one thing, Dave was about to take the argument even further. Soon, he would broaden the conversation beyond his personal controversies and begin speaking about a principle he considered even more important than any single joke: the freedom of artists to create without fear, and why he believed that freedom was worth protecting no matter how intense the backlash became. As the debates surrounding his comedy continued, Dave Chappelle gradually made it clear that, from his perspective, the conversation had grown far beyond a handful of controversial jokes. He believed the real issue wasn't whether every audience member agreed with his material. It was whether artists could continue creating freely without feeling pressured to avoid entire subjects out of fear. For Dave, that distinction mattered. He has often argued that comedy isn't simply about getting laughs. At its best, it's a way of examining society, exposing contradictions, and encouraging people to think differently about issues they might otherwise avoid. Sometimes that means making audiences uncomfortable. Sometimes it means provoking disagreement. But in his view, those reactions don't automatically mean the art has failed. In many cases, they mean the art has done exactly what it was intended to do. As criticism intensified, Dave increasingly shifted the conversation away from individual punchlines and toward a broader principle: artistic freedom. Rather than asking audiences to agree with every joke, he challenged them to think about what happens when creators begin censoring themselves before they even step onto a stage. If comedians constantly worry about the consequences of every word, he suggested, they'll eventually stop taking creative risks altogether. And once that happens, comedy itself begins to lose the unpredictability and honesty that make it unique. That belief became one of the defining themes of his later performances and public appearances. Whenever discussions centered on what comedians should or shouldn't be allowed to say, Dave often returned to the same core idea. Great art has rarely emerged from complete comfort. Throughout history, artists, writers, filmmakers, musicians, and comedians have often challenged prevailing opinions, questioned social norms, and explored uncomfortable realities. According to Dave, comedy deserves that same creative space. He also questioned the growing tendency to evaluate an entire career through the lens of one controversial moment. In his view, reducing years of work to a single headline or a few isolated quotes ignores the complexity of both the artist and the audience. A stand-up performance, he argued, is meant to be experienced as a whole, with stories, observations, and punchlines building toward larger themes. Pulling individual jokes out of that framework can dramatically change how they're understood. For many supporters, this message resonated because it extended beyond comedy. They saw Dave's arguments as part of a larger discussion about creativity itself. If one form of artistic expression becomes constrained by fear, they wondered whether similar pressures might eventually affect books, films, music, and other creative fields. From that perspective, the debate wasn't only about one comedian. It was about protecting the ability of artists to explore difficult ideas without assuming that every audience member must agree with them. Of course, critics viewed the issue differently. Many argued that artistic freedom and public criticism are not mutually exclusive. They maintained that artists are free to express themselves, while audiences are equally free to respond, challenge, or reject that expression. They questioned whether creative freedom alone resolves concerns about how certain jokes affect different communities or contribute to broader social conversations. Dave never suggested those disagreements would disappear. Instead, he seemed to accept that meaningful art naturally generates conflicting opinions. What mattered most to him wasn't eliminating criticism. It was preserving the freedom to continue creating despite it. In his view, the answer to controversial art wasn't silence, but more discussion, more debate, and ultimately more art. That philosophy became especially evident when he found himself speaking directly to a younger generation. Rather than avoiding difficult conversations, Dave welcomed the opportunity to explain why artistic nuance mattered so much to him. It would become one of the most revealing moments of his career, showing that behind the headlines and the controversy was a comedian determined to defend an idea he believed was bigger than any single performance. The freedom to create, to question, and to challenge audiences without surrendering to fear. By this stage of his career, Dave Chappelle had become accustomed to criticism from journalists, commentators, and strangers online. But one of the most memorable conversations happened in a place where he least expected it, a room full of students eager to question him directly. It wasn't a comedy club, and it wasn't a television interview. It was an open discussion that quickly became one of the most talked about moments in the ongoing debate surrounding his work. For many observers, this was a chance to see how Dave would respond without the protection of a scripted performance. The students raised concerns about some of the themes in his recent material, asking difficult questions about representation, responsibility, and the impact of certain jokes. It was a serious conversation, and emotions ran high. Rather than treating the disagreement as a personal attack, Dave listened carefully before explaining the philosophy that had guided his comedy for decades. His central argument wasn't that everyone had to enjoy his jokes. Instead, he emphasized that comedy, like any form of art, should be evaluated in its full context. A single line pulled from a much longer performance, he suggested, rarely captures the purpose of the entire act. In his view, understanding the broader message matters just as much as reacting to one individual punchline. Dave also expressed concern about something he believed was becoming increasingly common. He argued that many public debates focus on isolated quotes while overlooking artistic nuance. According to him, people sometimes rush to judge a performance before considering how its different parts connect or what larger ideas the comedian is trying to explore. Whether people ultimately agreed with his conclusions or not, He encouraged them to engage with the complete work rather than fragments of it. The discussion soon became larger than one comedy special. It evolved into a conversation about how art should be criticized in general. Dave challenged the idea that disagreement should automatically lead to shutting down creative expression. Instead, he suggested that if someone believes an artist is wrong, the strongest response isn't censorship. It's creating something better, presenting a stronger argument, or offering a more compelling artistic vision. That perspective reflected a belief he had repeated throughout his career. Competition, debate, and different viewpoints have always been part of the creative world. Great ideas don't survive because they're protected from criticism. They survive because they're tested, challenged, and refined in public. From Dave's perspective, comedy should be no different. What stood out most during the exchange was his willingness to continue the conversation even when opinions sharply differed. He didn't pretend everyone would leave agreeing with him, and he didn't suggest the students were wrong simply for asking hard questions. Instead, he encouraged them to think independently, examine art carefully, and recognize that creative expression often involves complexity rather than simple answers. For supporters, this reinforced the image of Dave as someone defending the importance of open dialogue. For critics, the discussion showed that the disagreements surrounding his work remained unresolved. But regardless of where people stood, the conversation highlighted a broader truth. The controversy was no longer just about one comedian or one special. It had become part of a much larger discussion about how society engages with art, criticism, and free expression. And perhaps the most surprising part came afterward. Despite all the headlines and heated debates, Dave continued demonstrating that his principles extended beyond his own career. Before long, he would turn his attention to another comedian facing enormous public pressure, using that moment to explain why he believed context, intent, and the ability to grow should matter just as much as the mistakes of the past. By the time Dave Chappelle had weathered years of public controversy himself, he had developed a clear pattern. Whenever another comedian found themselves at the center of a media storm, he rarely stayed silent for long. It wasn't because he believed every joke was beyond criticism. It was because he believed comedy should be judged with context, and that a career shouldn't be defined by a single moment taken in isolation. One of the clearest examples came when fellow comedian Kevin Hart became the focus of intense public scrutiny after old social media posts resurfaced during the lead-up to a major hosting opportunity. The controversy quickly dominated entertainment headlines, with renewed attention on jokes and comments he had made years earlier. Before long, the discussion had shifted away from Kevin's accomplishments and toward whether those past remarks should determine his future. Dave watched the situation unfold with growing concern. From his perspective, the debate raised a much bigger question than the fate of one comedian. It forced people to ask whether individuals should be judged only by the worst thing they've ever said, or whether growth, context, and the passage of time should also matter. That question became central to Dave's response. Rather than simply defending his friend, Dave challenged the broader idea that old material should automatically outweigh everything that came afterward. He acknowledged that audiences have every right to disagree with a comedian's work and to express criticism. But he also questioned whether revisiting years-old jokes, without considering the full picture, creates a fair understanding of the person behind them. To Dave, intent mattered. Comedy often relies on exaggeration, irony, satire, and fictional scenarios designed to provoke laughter rather than communicate literal beliefs. While he understood why certain jokes might offend some viewers, he argued that interpreting every punchline as a direct reflection of a comedian's personal values risks misunderstanding how stand-up actually works. Supporters agreed with that perspective, arguing that performers should be evaluated on their complete body of work rather than isolated moments. They believed artists, like everyone else, have the capacity to evolve over time, and that public conversations should leave room for growth instead of assuming people remain permanently defined by past mistakes. Critics, however, saw the issue differently. Many believed that influential public figures should be held accountable for earlier statements, especially when those statements involve sensitive subjects. From that viewpoint, revisiting old material isn't necessarily about punishing someone forever. It's about examining how words can continue to affect people, even years after they were first spoken. They argued that accountability and artistic freedom can exist at the same time. Dave didn't ignore those concerns. Instead, he questioned whether the public conversation sometimes becomes less interested in understanding and more interested in punishment. He suggested that outrage can quickly become an end in itself, with little attention paid to whether someone has changed, learned, or demonstrated a different perspective over time. In his view, meaningful accountability should encourage reflection and growth rather than simply ending careers. That belief reflected something larger than friendship. Whether he was speaking about himself or another comedian, Dave consistently returned to the same principle. Comedy depends on the freedom to experiment, take risks, and occasionally fail. If every mistake becomes permanent, he argued, artists may stop taking creative chances altogether, and the art form itself could become less honest and less original. Looking back, Dave's defense of fellow comedians wasn't about claiming they were beyond criticism. It was about resisting a culture where one controversy could overshadow decades of work without allowing room for context or change. Agree or disagree with his conclusions, that consistency became one of the defining features of his public philosophy. And after years of watching debates over jokes, headlines, and public outrage dominate the entertainment world, Dave arrived at a broader conclusion. He came to believe that laughter has a unique power, not because it erases disagreement, but because it can expose contradictions, challenge assumptions, and keep difficult conversations alive in a way that few other forms of expression can. That idea would become the foundation of his most enduring message. For Dave Chappelle, laughter has never been just entertainment. It's a tool, a way to challenge ideas, expose contradictions, and make people question assumptions they might otherwise accept without hesitation. While many people see comedy as an escape from serious issues, Dave has long argued that the best comedians do the exact opposite. They walk straight into the most uncomfortable conversations and somehow find a way to make audiences laugh while thinking at the same time. That philosophy became one of the defining characteristics of his career. Whenever public debates grew more heated, Dave rarely responded with anger. Instead, he responded with another joke. Not because he believed every issue was funny, but because he believed humor could reveal the inconsistencies in an argument faster than a lengthy speech ever could. A well-crafted punchline, in his view, has a unique way of cutting through emotion and forcing people to look at a situation from an entirely different angle. He has often suggested that comedy succeeds when it makes people feel two emotions at once. An audience might laugh immediately, only to realize a few seconds later that the joke was pointing towards something much deeper. That balance between humor and reflection is what Dave has spent decades refining. Rather than offering simple answers, he often presents complicated situations and lets the audience wrestle with the contradictions themselves. It's one of the reasons his performances continue generating conversations long after the curtain comes down. People don't simply remember the jokes. They remember the questions those jokes raised. Was he criticizing society? Was he exposing hypocrisy? Was he challenging the audience's own assumptions? Depending on who you ask, the answers are often completely different. And perhaps that's exactly the point. Dave has repeatedly argued that disagreement isn't evidence that comedy has failed. If everyone leaves a performance thinking exactly the same thing, then perhaps the comedian hasn't challenged anyone at all. In his view, memorable comedy doesn't always produce unanimous agreement. Sometimes it creates debate. Sometimes it makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes it even sparks criticism. But those reactions can also become part of a broader public conversation that extends far beyond the stage. Supporters believe this willingness to provoke discussion is what separates great comedians from merely popular ones. They argue that laughter can lower people's defenses, allowing difficult topics to be explored in ways that would be nearly impossible through ordinary debate. A joke can open the door to conversations about culture, politics, identity, or human nature without feeling like a lecture. Even when audiences disagree with the conclusion, they are often willing to engage with the question because humor made the discussion more approachable. Critics, however, continue to raise an important counterpoint. They argue that while comedy can certainly challenge ideas, comedians also have influence, and influence comes with responsibility. From their perspective, the fact that something is presented as a joke doesn't automatically remove concerns about how different audiences may interpret or experience it. They believe humor and accountability can exist side by side, and that both deserve serious consideration. Dave has never claimed that comedy should be beyond criticism. Instead, his broader message has consistently been that criticism should lead to discussion rather than fear. He has argued that audiences should absolutely respond, debate, disagree, or even reject material they dislike. But he has also maintained that comedians should remain free to test ideas through humor, trusting audiences to decide for themselves what succeeds and what falls flat. Looking back over his career, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every major controversy eventually faded, but the conversations continued. New comedians emerged, public debates evolved, and cultural attitudes shifted, yet Dave's central belief remained remarkably consistent. Laughter has the power to reveal truths that ordinary arguments often cannot. Whether people applauded his approach or challenged it, they kept talking about it. And in many ways, that's exactly what comedy has always been designed to do. And after years of standing at the center of those debates, Dave's legacy became about far more than individual jokes. It became about his refusal to abandon the principles he believed defined comedy itself, even when the pressure to change had never been greater. That legacy is where our story reaches its final chapter. What ultimately separates Dave Chappelle from many of his peers isn't that he has avoided controversy. In fact, the opposite is true. Few comedians in modern history have spent as much time at the center of public debate. Yet despite years of criticism, headlines, and endless arguments across television, newspapers, podcasts, and social media, Dave remains one of the most recognizable and influential voices in stand-up comedy. That alone says something remarkable about the relationship between controversy and artistic longevity. Throughout his career, there have been countless predictions that a particular joke, interview, or comedy special would finally mark the end of his success. Every new wave of backlash was accompanied by claims that audiences would turn away and that his influence would fade. But time after time, those predictions failed to materialize. His performances continued attracting sold-out crowds, his specials remained among the most discussed releases in comedy, and his name stayed firmly at the center of cultural conversations. Whether people admired his work or strongly disagreed with it, they continued paying attention. That may be one of the defining features of Dave's legacy. He has never measured success by universal approval. Instead, his career reflects a willingness to accept that meaningful art often divides opinion. Rather than trying to satisfy every audience, he has consistently focused on expressing his perspective, knowing that agreement and disagreement are both natural responses to creative work. Supporters often point to this consistency as one of his greatest strengths. They argue that Dave has refused to dramatically alter his voice simply because public pressure increased. From their perspective, he has demonstrated that an artist can listen to criticism without allowing criticism alone to dictate every creative decision. They see his career as an example of remaining committed to a personal vision, even when doing so invites intense scrutiny. Critics, on the other hand, continue to challenge aspects of his material and question whether some jokes contribute to harmful stereotypes or overlook the experiences of certain communities. They argue that artistic freedom and public accountability are not opposing ideas but complementary ones, and that influential performers should expect thoughtful criticism alongside public success. Those competing viewpoints have become inseparable from Dave Chappelle's story. Instead of existing only as a comedian, he has become a central figure in one of the largest ongoing discussions in entertainment. Where should society draw the line between creative freedom and social responsibility? It's a question with no simple answer, which is precisely why the debate has continued year after year. Perhaps the most interesting part is that Dave has rarely tried to present himself as someone with all the answers. More often, he has positioned himself as someone asking difficult questions and inviting audiences to think through them. His routines frequently leave room for interpretation, encouraging viewers to decide for themselves where they stand rather than delivering straightforward conclusions. That openness is one reason people often leave his performances continuing the conversation long after the final joke. Looking back, it's clear that Dave's impact extends far beyond individual punchlines or isolated controversies. His career has become part of a broader discussion about comedy, free expression, audience expectations, and the evolving role of entertainers in a rapidly changing culture. Whether future generations ultimately celebrate or criticize his approach, his influence on modern stand-up comedy is likely to remain a significant part of that conversation. In the end, Dave Chappelle's legacy isn't defined solely by the laughs he generated or the controversies he sparked. It's defined by his refusal to stop creating, his willingness to defend the importance of artistic expression, and his determination to keep stepping onto the stage even when the spotlight became more intense than ever before. And perhaps that's the biggest takeaway from his journey. Long after the headlines fade and today's debates evolve into tomorrow's history, one fact will remain difficult to dispute. Dave Chappelle never allowed controversy to become the final chapter of his story. Instead, he kept doing what comedians have always done at their best, challenging audiences, provoking conversations, and reminding the world that comedy isn't just about making people laugh. Sometimes it's about making people think. Before we wrap up, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Dave Chappelle's career has never been defined by universal agreement. Instead, it's been shaped by an ongoing conversation about where comedy begins, where offense ends, and how much freedom artists should have to challenge their audiences. Whether people view him as a fearless defender of artistic expression or believe some of his material goes too far, his work has undeniably influenced the broader discussion about comedy and culture. Over the years, Dave has faced criticism from journalists, activists, fellow entertainers, and audiences. Some of that criticism has focused on individual jokes, while some has questioned the larger themes explored in his performances. At the same time, countless fans have continued to support his work, arguing that comedy should be allowed to tackle difficult subjects and that audiences should consider the full context of a performance before reaching conclusions. Those differing perspectives are part of what has made his career one of the most closely watched in modern entertainment. What makes his story remarkable isn't simply the number of controversies he's experienced. It's the consistency of his response. Instead of stepping away from the spotlight every time public debate intensified, he continued performing, continued writing, and continued defending his belief that comedy should remain a place where uncomfortable conversations can happen. Agree with him or disagree with him, that consistency has become one of the defining characteristics of his career. Perhaps that's why Dave Chappelle continues to occupy such a unique place in comedy. Years after many of these debates first began, people are still discussing his performances, analyzing his arguments, and debating the role comedians should play in an ever-changing society. Few entertainers generate that level of lasting conversation, and even fewer continue doing so across multiple generations of audiences. Ultimately, the larger question extends far beyond one comedian. It's about how society balances creative freedom with public criticism, how audiences interpret satire, and how art evolves alongside changing cultural values. Those questions don't have simple answers, which is exactly why the conversation continues long after the final joke has been told. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Do you believe Dave Chappelle is simply doing what great comedians have always done, challenging audiences and pushing conversations forward? Or do you think modern comedy should adapt to changing social expectations, even if that means avoiding certain topics? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As always, respectful discussion is welcome, and we'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next breakdown of the biggest moments in comedy, entertainment, and celebrity culture. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.